You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name is Trent Fleskens, your host as always. I can't believe we're already past the state election. As we said before with Luke last week, no surprises what was going on with that. And we look forward now to the federal election. And we think about government, we think about the things that they start to add value to society for. And one of the things they've been working hard on over the last few years was the medium density code, the R codes, these planning parameters are the things in the property and planning and construction space that affect us and guide us and restrain us sometimes when we're looking to do what we do, express ourselves as property people, build a home for ourselves, for someone else, all the way to commercial and industrial property. But what we do know is that the documents that have guided the planning and design phase have become bigger and bigger, more and more unwieldy, and for most people, just like the Bible itself, far too long to bother reading from back to front at any point, even for those professionals in the industry that work with it every day. So in response to that, someone I respect greatly in this industry has taken it on upon himself in his semi-retirement to put it on his shoulders and have a crack at presenting just the idea that maybe we don't need such a prescriptive document, that we can leave some of the judgment to the professionals and the developers and the stakeholders that be on each project to try and do good for our society, and instead provide a much more understandable, a much more consumable, palatable, and much shorter document that summarizes all of the bolt-ons we've had over the decades to a bunch of fundamental principles that is all we need to be able to press go and move a lot quicker than we have been, so that everyone can understand our pathway going forward. That's the summary, I think, of the conversation we're going to have, and we're going to have it with Malcolm Mackay, urban designer, semi-retired, but still very much relevant in our West Australian planning and architectural and design and property industry in 2025. Mate, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Trent, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I think probably a good place to start is that description of me being semi-retired. I've been practicing in WA for over 30 years, and it's generally been get up, work all day, and go to bed, get up the following morning, rinse and repeat. And I haven't had a lot of chance until recently to actually sit back and think about it. I guess I've got to that stage in life where I do have time now to reflect on those last 30 years and how things have changed over the course of that period, particularly from a professional perspective. And the most recent reflection was on the R codes, and which has been the bane of my life as much as the bane of any designer's life in WA for quite some time.
How have they changed, as you said, over that 30-year period?
They've changed a lot. The R codes predate me in WA. They came out in, I think, 1985, roughly, so about 40 years ago. I didn't come out here until 94. But it was coming from the UK and arriving in WA, and everything was so much smaller. It was all very suburban. And the R codes were a relatively simple document that basically provided some parameters around designing single houses and basic grouped housing.
Yeah, a lot of land-based development, how you can subdivide things to what density.
Yeah, and
they still are today.
It is, and it was very much focused on density, and because lot size seemed to be a really big thing here in WA, and back in the UK it was almost irrelevant.
What would have been relevant 100 years earlier, maybe. You're obviously living in a multiple dwelling, group dwelling situation in the UK in the last century, and we're still transitioning into it in this one.
Absolutely, very different. And I'll come to talking about the difference between urban and suburban environments, but I came from an urban environment to a suburban one, and the R codes was doing a reasonable job at just setting the basic parameters on lot sizes and how far you could build to the boundaries and height, and just the basic parameters so that no one was going to design a house that was completely out of scale.
Abhorrent.
Abhorrent to the neighbours, and that was fine.
And I assume not many people were looking to test that at that time either.
No,
it was fairly utilitarian construction back then.
It wasn't. There was basically the vast majority of housing was single story. The whole issues that arise when you have higher levels, they weren't there. The grouped housing was pretty basic, and apartments were almost non-existent. It was a different world. And then we got into 15, 20 years down the track. We started to see a lot more apartments come in. The developments got bigger. They got more intensive, and the development industry was throwing up lots of question marks as to what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. And
what are the boundaries boundaries?
And are the boundaries actually too restrictive because the whole economic situation was changing as well?
So I guess a lot of this was like East Perth, West Perth, the city. That was really where a lot of it would have been constrained to at that point, right?
Pretty well, yeah, and particularly the newer and the bigger stuff. And I think what happened then in the 2010s was that there was a significant change to the R codes. They just got a lot bigger, particularly to accommodate apartment development. And then it changed again, and Volume 2 came in, and it got even bigger still. And then more recently, Volume 1 got revisited to bring in the medium density. And we're now in this situation where we have 2 volumes of our codes.
Parts.
And the Volume 1 has multiple parts for different densities. And then there's a whole heap of explanatory guidelines which cover part of it, but not the rest. And they together, they cover about 485 pages. And I think the original R codes, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, were in the 20s. It was a much smaller document. So it has grown massively. And also just the complications that I've got a project at the moment, which is covered by a structure plan, and the density, it's R40 to R80. That's all it says. So do I design at R40?
Which is a different part of
which is Volume 1 of the
codes,
codes, or do I design at R80, which is Volume 2 of the codes? Which do I apply? Or do I apply both? And when there's a difference between the two, which one do I pick?
Which one am I allowed to pick?
Yes.
What this has done is also, Malcolm, has created an industry, a very profitable industry for planning consultants and architects. Surprise, surprise. I don't know if it was meant this way, but it certainly is self-fulfilling now, where no one can understand it. And so everyone's getting paid to argue it on either behalf. Planning lawyers as well.
Planning lawyers.
Making a lot of money out of this.
I was going to add to the list.
Yep.
And I've been through the SAT process on numerous occasions, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other. And sometimes I've just been tearing my hair out at, not that I have any, but some of the inanity of it. I remember a SAT mediation some years ago where the whole argument on refusal revolved around the distance from a balustrade from one apartment to the boundary, which apparently was 37 millimeters too close. So instead of being 7.5 meters, it was fractionally less. And then you're sitting in SAT for 2 days arguing about this.
There's $50,000 out the door.
Exactly. And then there was another one where it was a 2-story house on a sloping site, and depending on the particular point that you measured from, part of the roof was 150 millimeters too high. If you're standing there on the ground looking up at it, you're never going to see the difference. So the R codes in that level of detail is giving rise to a whole level of complexity. And
so the more detail there is, the more there is to argue about.
Exactly. In fact, even this morning, I was in a DRP meeting this morning. And so someone made the comment, the devil is in the detail.
It is the devil.
And I said, yeah. And said, the more detail you've got, the more devilish opportunity there is. And that kind of aligns with my thinking that perhaps we shouldn't be making the R codes bigger every time we stumble across a new thing that needs to be codified. That we should, in fact, be simplifying the R codes and bringing it right back to basics.
What are those basics?
The basics for me are principally the 10 principles of SPP7. I've spoken before about.
What are they for someone who may not have listened to you before? They design things, they planning things. Where can I put my car? What is it?
They're broader issues than that. They're context and character, landscape, the built form and scale, functionality and build quality, sustainability, amenity, legibility, safety, community, aesthetics.
They're all very qualitative things.
They're all very qualitative things.
You can't really codify that, can you?
You can to a certain extent, but it's a bit like life. You can't codify everything.
The R codes try to.
They do, and that's where the problem lies. We all subscribe, or at least most of us subscribe, that we all do our best to be good. Now, you could say, as a fundamental principle for life, we should be good. But then you get down into that little detail of what does that actually mean. But notwithstanding the detail, the principle's really well understood.
Yeah, and they all are the same.
Yeah, and you can go back and you can say, what I've just done, is that good or not? I've just come around the corner.
Yeah, the principles are consistent. The pathway to getting there is open to interpretation, but also open to people's own agency because sometimes they'll make a mistake, but oftentimes they'll innovate. They'll push the needle. And society changes over time as well with what they believe is acceptable or not. I'm sure what we believe in 2025 as acceptable density would have been absolutely abhorrent in 1985.
Absolutely. It's very dynamic.
So they've tried to update these R codes to keep doing it. But what you're saying is the principles have never changed. It's just how we apply those principles that has shifted over time and will continue to shift.
Exactly. And with the R codes, because the R codes predate these principles, they didn't have the principles there in the first place. They were just a nebulous assumption. So I think now that we've got these principles, and they are good principles,
Most people agree with them, do you think, Malcolm, in the industry? If you
my
put it out,
my experience is yes. My partner and I, we sit on like 20 design review panels between us, and we use the principles as the Bible for design review, and they work incredibly well. That they give you guidance, almost like spiritual guidance or moral guidance, but without the level of detail that enables you to have flexibility in how they're interpreted. So
it was state government architect Jeff Warren who created these principles a number of years ago, wasn't it?
It was, and I think it's probably one of the best things that's ever happened in the WA.
But they've sort of acted like a bolt-on, haven't they? Isn't that the point? Is that the R codes have been so codified that the principles are a secondary pathway if you can't fit the R codes?
Yeah, and for me, that's the wrong way. That's back to front.
Yeah, what you're saying is we should actually have our foundation in the principles of design, and the R code should reflect that, whether codified or not.
Yeah. And one of the fundamental things that I've done in my review of the R codes is I've gone and said, these 10 principles, this is the structure, this is the guidance, and that everything else, all of the detail that's in there, falls under those principles. And so that turns it completely on its head. Whereas the R codes had a set of principles, but there were lots and lots of detailed principles. But what it didn't do was go back to basics and say, where do those detailed principles, how do they fit into this broader moral code for planning?
Because the more you codify, the more you end up uncovering situations in the complexity of Perth's topography and suburban nature that don't fit within the codes, even if they would fit the principles. And then you can come back and say, well, then just take the other pathway, use the principles. But I think the point is it shouldn't, as you're saying, it shouldn't be seen as the alternative pathway. It shouldn't be seen as we have to meet design excellence just to not use the R codes, because your site's a bit different.
Yeah, and embedding it in and becoming the main structure of the codes embeds those principles into the document and into your thinking about it. And it's interesting, again, harking back to design review, and I review probably 150 projects a year. So I do see a lot. One of the principles that architects and developers generally struggle with is sustainability. They know what it means. They know it's something that they probably ought to be doing, but they don't know how to do it. And when you go through the R codes, there's actually very little in there, very little guidance.
This is such a new thing, and I think it's an ever-progressing thing as well, sustainability. What was sustainability even just 3 or 4 years ago, with new technology, new standards within the community, is constantly evolving, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. But what we're seeing is a lot of people are still tacking it as a bolt-on. So here's my project. What can I stick on it to make it more sustainable?
I would agree with that.
Whereas what you should be doing is, before you even put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard in designing something, you should be thinking about sustainability up front.
I think the hard thing as a developer, Malcolm, is that when you start with sustainability first, you're most likely going to end up with the most expensive outcome first, and then having to strip it away often from a developer's point of view.
I disagree with that. And
please.
And my view, there's obviously a lot of talk about sustainability, a lot of documentation there about what it means, and it's a different thing to different people. One of the best pieces of advice I've had from other consultants was from an architect from the US called Steph Polizoides. And he said one of the fundamental principles of sustainability that nobody talks about is thrift.
That's because for the most part in Western Australia, people aren't talking about thrift when they're talking about sustainability. They're talking essentially about EV car chargers, solar panels, and more trees. And if you can't give us that, then we're not going to approve your project, which is cost.
And I've made the observation in other forums that some of the most sustainable buildings, or remnants of sustainable buildings I've seen, are actually in Pomp, where they had cross ventilation, they captured water and they reused water. They did a whole bunch of things that we think are all fancy ideas now, but they did them because they had very little material, very little resources, and they had to preserve them. So they had to be thrifty. They had to be thrifty, and so being thrifty brings a level of sustainability to a building, but it's something that nobody talks about.
But do you think it's also because we don't really have the professionals in Western Australia that have the experience to be thrift first in their design, and a community that, to be frank, will always rather the aircon turning on than a nice ceiling fan that is perfectly placed.
Yeah, there are societal aspects. There's designer ego as well. Is that a lot of designers see a new project as an opportunity to do their next masterpiece.
There's a lot of that.
And they'll throw everything at it, and it will inherently get more expensive. There are factors, but I think that notion of simplifying something is really important. We've overcomplicated the design process, and the R codes have contributed to that. I've often used the analogy with the R codes that it's like a Holden Kingswood. It's sort of 45 years old, and the owner has gone down to super cheap autos every few months or every couple of years and bought some shiny gadgets to stick on it to make it more modern.
Yeah, updating it, but not really keeping to the core of it.
And so essentially that Kingswood is now lumbering along. It's twice as heavy as it ever used to be, which has a whole bunch of useless things that aren't really needed, when in fact what we need now is a Tesla, which is basically a giant iPad in a box with a wheel at each corner and 17 moving parts. That's far more comfortable and far faster and safer than a Kingswood could ever be.
So how do we get to that? We've spoken about the principles. What you provided me is 5 fundamentals. Now, I'm not sure what the difference is between a principle and a fundamental. I'd love you to explain to me. I'm hoping it's more of a condensing of the principles.
Yeah.
And then we can also talk to some real flashpoints, such as how that applies to plot ratio, height limit, parking, setbacks, density, all the things that most people would actually go, oh yeah, I know how that affects me.
My version of the codes, my short 8-page version, as opposed to the 485-page version of the Tomb, which I think worked out at about something like 40% of the length of Tolstoy's War and Peace. That to get it that short, there are some fundamental moves. And so the first fundamental for me was getting back to what is the degree of urbanity that we are looking for. One of the comments that I've made repeatedly is that we have, around the world, we have great urban places, brilliant urban places. You pay thousands of dollars to fly to Europe.
To be in that
to be in that great urban environment and drink coffee and eat pizza. So we know what good urbanism is, and we have really good suburbanism too. That there are some fantastic suburban places.
In Perth?
Even in Perth.
Yeah.
You go to,
what are examples?
You go to some of the older suburbs and Mount Lawley and Menora or Nedlands or Dalkeith or wherever. There's really nice suburbs. Even the smaller ones, Mount Hawthorn.
Vic Park, I would say.
Vic Park.
Leadable.
I'm almost reluctant to say Subiaco, but I'd have to acknowledge that too. And they have a very distinctive character compared to the urbanity. Urbanity is about buildings that cuddle up together. They rub shoulders. It's all about the architecture and the streetscape and the use, and there's a scale to it. Whereas suburban development, it's buildings that sit in the landscape. So it's the landscape that takes precedence. It's the gardens at the front. It's the gardens at the back. It's the fact that the buildings don't touch each other. They sit like little pavilions in the landscape. That's what makes a really good suburban environment.
The irony of that is they haven't been built for decades. You're talking about suburbs that are 100 years old.
Yes, when people got it right.
Yeah.
And I think
what have we been doing since then? Just shit?
What we've been doing since then, and more recently probably in the last 20 years, is we've been blurring the boundary between urbanism and suburbanism. We've been creating this Frankenstein that's neither one nor the other. It doesn't have all the great qualities of an urban environment, and it doesn't have all the great qualities of a suburban environment. It's between the two.
You're right, but this is the point, is that you go from an urban centre like Perth into suburban areas that are 100 years old, and the further out you get, ironically, the denser it starts to get.
Yeah, so it's all back to front, and you end up with this environment that doesn't have the appealing qualities of an urban environment and the activity and the density, but it doesn't have the landscape either. It's all garages and carports and driveways, and it's nowhere. And the changes in the R codes in the last couple of decades have accelerated that. And so one of my fundamentals is going back and saying we need to distinguish between them. We need to say we want these places to be urban, and we're going to make them the best urban places they can be. Those places, they stay suburban, and they can be the best suburban environments. And there's actually a third one, which is ex-urban, but that's a rural living, a very rural type of area.
And they seem to be doing fine.
They're fine. They look after themselves to a large extent. That fundamental move for me was recognizing that we need to distinguish between urban and suburban, decide which places are which, and code accordingly. And that might mean increasing densities and heights and decreasing setbacks in urban environments, but increasing them in suburban areas and almost stepping suburban areas backwards. So people have more garden, more landscape.
How do you do that when most of these newer suburbs that have houses that are 1 to 30 years old and are extremely large compared to the lot sizes in comparison to your Mount Lawley, for example, as a percentage, aren't going to get knocked down anytime soon? They might be around for 100 years. How do you change that? It is what it is.
It is what it is. I don't think you count that ship has
But are you
sailed.
talking about the next level, your Mundajong, your East Wanneroo starting to become less dense again?
Yep, I think.
How do we afford that? Because the people who are buying out there are young people who are already having to pay $1,000 a square metre, $1,000 for 400 square metres out in Henley Brook, for example, and then pay 400 and something grand for that big house that they want. They're not going to live in the 3x2 size or 3x1 size Vic Park home on 400 square metres. That's why they want to live out there. How are we going to actually afford the suburban optimism that you're looking for, given, I'd say, one of the biggest reasons the outcomes we have are what they are, is money?
Yeah, and look, I don't disagree with that. I'm a realist at heart. I would use a couple of examples. The first example is Manira and myself. Our first home in the UK was a studio apartment. It wasn't a 4x2.
That's a great point. That's a great point. So offer alternatives.
Exactly. So I think that's part of the balance process. The
alternatives that work, right? And this is where you get into is that if you're going to put apartments up, if you're going to put cottage lots, townhouses, all these things up, let's put them where they actually are in locations in urban areas with a bit of density where there is activity centres that are already there in ways that do maximise these design principles.
Exactly. And the other issue that we have at the moment in that what we're essentially doing is forcing first-home buyers and young people to live as far away as they possibly can in pursuit of the cheap land. But then they lack into places that lack the services. They end up buying 2 cars and running 2 cars. And then their household running costs
go up
massively. So they're not actually saving money.
They stay lower socioeconomic. They never have the opportunity. So the way to fix that is to provide better outcomes closer to the city. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And my second example that I was to use was I did a lot of work in Sydney probably about 20 years ago. And a lot of that was revolved around the growth areas of Sydney. And it was interesting at the time because Sydney was the complete opposite of Perth. But what was happening in Sydney, because of the policies that were in place, was that living on the fringe was a privilege for the wealthy. And the development that we were seeing at the time on the fringe were very large houses on large lots in the fringe. For those who could afford it, first-home buyers were essentially buying apartments in the inner and middle suburbs. The complete reverse of Perth, where in Perth there were very few apartment developments. It tended to be on the South Perth foreshore or in Crawley or somewhere where people were buying large, expensive apartments. And those who could least afford it were living further out on the fringe.
That's our reality today.
Yeah. And the broader planning framework in WA has constantly, for the last 2 decades, said we need to change. We need to refocus development into the inner and middle areas where the infrastructure and services are. And everyone says all these things, they say all the right noises. And then when we look at the stats at the end of each year, basically
nothing's changed. Or it's gone worse.
It's got worse.
And since COVID, it has gone far worse in terms of that outcome.
There's more suburban sprawl now than there ever was in the past.
And that's not because suburban sprawl is happening more prevalently than it was. It's that it's more obvious now because nearly no urban density is coming in. So as a percentage, it's like 90%, to be frank. So the first fundamental is clearly defining what's urban and what's suburban. And I guess the reason for that is to allow you to have more flexibility to be more creative in the urban environments.
Yes, and it's also just making sure that every part of the metro area is being the best that it can, that you're not compromising one for the benefit of another.
Let's go to the second fundamental then.
So the second fundamental move was expressing different forms of development as a typology. Now, I'll explain that. Working backwards, in my experience, no one really can explain what an R60 looks like. You can't walk down the street and go, oh, look, there's an R60. Oh, there's an R50. There's an R1. Some planners might do that, but
some developers.
Possibly some developers, but most of the population...
Most wouldn't know what that is in the first place.
And look, to be honest, I think a lot of people in the profession probably struggle to pick what density a building is. So my experience is that, particularly in working with communities, is that if you show them a picture of a type of building or a type of place,
townhouse.
They get it straight away. You go, that's an apartment block. I get that. That's an attached terrace house. I get that. It's a single house. I get that. And so what I did then was, so you can take that approach and you can deal with it a little bit more broadly. And you can talk about the whole of the residential areas of the metropolitan area as a series of development. So starting with city. Everyone knows city means big buildings, tall buildings, lots of activity on the ground. People think immediately of the CB.
But they would never know what the height limit is or what it should be, unless it's been codified for them to look up and have a whinge about.
Yeah, and most people probably don't care what the plot ratio of a building in.
Well, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't be able to tell from the street. And this is a great example. You think about an application that went through the ringer in North Perth, Alma Square from Celsius, that was arguing over whether it should be 14 stories or 11 stories or 10 stories or 9 stories. And the big gripe that a lot of the locals had, or at least hung their hat on, was that the code says 6 and you're making it 14 or 11. None of it's acceptable unless it's 6. You have to follow the rules. These are the rules. Follow them. Whether or not that actually had anything to do with what the outcome that would have for the community. From a positive on more density, in terms of more options for young people, for downsizers, as for regenerating the ground floor, cafes, and what that would bring to the community. Everyone was more focused on, well, you're breaking the rules. I actually agree with you here. If there wasn't a rule on height, for the most part, in what was city or not city, and we just said, hey, developer, if you can justify 18 stories, and you can do it now, we're never going to get another chance again to do 18. Because if we do 9 now and we should have probably had 18 in 20 years, we can't knock it down and do 18 again. So wouldn't you just let the developer let on that risk to go, if the developer can justify it because society is demanding it, then that's probably the truth. Why are we arguing over what the height is when you could actually focus on the fundamental principles again?
Yeah, and I think if you're doing it in the right place, if you're doing it in a place where city-scale development is anticipated, where it's already happened, where it's anticipated, where it makes sense, then fine. Perth City, East Perth, South Perth, there's a lot of places around town where if someone wants to do a 30-story tower, really, are we going to lose sleep about it? That was my first one, which was...
Great point. Great to come from a design person who sits on a DRP.
Easily identifiable. The next one for me was general urban. And general urban for me is that European scale of development. If you go to Paris or Barcelona or wherever, it's for 4 to 8 stories. It's buildings that touch each other. It's commercial on the ground floor. It's doing all the things that I, as an urban designer, particularly love, because that's the thing that urban designers like. And there are plenty of places around town where that is appropriate.
Are there any good examples of where it currently is?
We see bits of it in the new areas of Subiaco. We see it in East Perth. There's dribbles of it around the place. There's some in Fremantle. There's some in South Perth. We're not particularly good at that sort of European form of development, largely because when we have buildings of 8 stories, the R codes tell us that we have to set them back from the neighbouring sites.
Yeah.
We can't create those cohesive streetscapes and we get scared of what the neighbours are going to say.
I think you're right. There's a dearth of options in society for stuff that's more than 2 stories, really, to be honest, and 10. Every area between there is nearly hamstrung, not only by fire safety rules, which are just ridiculous in some cases.
Economics as well.
Yeah, but also economics. But economics, because of the restrictions that are placed on these buildings in the first place.
Yeah.
On things like setbacks, overlooking, overshadowing. For God's sake, if we're in a zoning that is foreshadowing, pardon the pun, apartments, why are we bothered about overshadowing the house that hasn't turned into an apartment yet? For God's sake, people, what are we talking about? Because there's a code.
And that gets back to the role of the planning framework to set expectations, where it says this area here, this is going to be an urban area. This is what it's going to be. It might be a little bit of pain in getting there, but that's what it's going to be. And so let's make it the best urban area that we possibly can.
Because you can only do it once, generally.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you go to Europe and there's urban buildings that have been standing for several hundred years and going away anywhere soon.
We love those the most because they didn't have a 485-page code. They were developer-led, design-led in a lot of ways, and clearly the market at that point.
And they were thrifty too.
And they were very thrifty.
So that was general urban. My next one was village urban, which is the smaller version. It's the baby brother of the village urban. So it's your 3 to 5 stories. It's got a comfortable kind of scale. It's still got some of those urban qualities, and the buildings attached to each other. The buildings come up to the street. It's just your local centre. It's the sort of thing you might expect somewhere like Mount Hawthorn, for example, to develop into over time. Beyond that, then I go to to attached residential, which is essentially residential buildings that touch each other.
They can be splattered around everywhere, can't they?
They've been lots of different places. This is basically what people term medium density. Anything from R40 through to R80 would fall into that category. And it could be terraced housing, it could be grouped housing, but generally they touch each other. We then go to detached residential, which is buildings that stand alone. They have spaces between them. And that's getting back to that suburban notion that we spoke about earlier. Garden residential, which is the larger, greener suburbs, the precious western suburbs.
Coolbinia, Menora.
Which are beautiful. And I'd be one of the last people to advocate that we should start redeveloping those with grouped housing or multiple dwellings, or allowing the buildings to touch each other and knock down trees in the process. They have other quality, and that should be retained. And then rural living, which is the last one. And then what I've done is, through a table, is try to match those development typologies to the R codes. And so what typologies you'd expect under what R coding. So having done that, I can then basically get rid of the numbers. The numbers don't count anymore, because it's all about
the outcome,
the typology.
Okay, so that's fundamental 2, is making it more lay about how we talk about what we expect. Fundamental 3?
Fundamental 3 is about that's this whole thing about getting back to basics. So it's focusing what's important. One of my core skills has been master planning, and I've master planned lots of things, including the Optus Stadium in Burswood. But people have often asked, what's the core skill when it comes to master planning? And I said it's being able to sieve. And because the projects are usually large and complex, you have to be able to look through masses and masses of information and work out what's relevant and what's not. You get out the noise, get rid of the noise, focus in on the basics. And this is similar, and it's about getting back to what are the really important things that we need to hold on to in the R codes. Now, some of those are already in there. They just need to be seized and clarified, and some of them are not in there and need to be put in. But it's about that, back to basics and avoiding the detail. One of my observations, I guess, is that the R codes have probably got to the size they are is because someone in government has tried to codify everything. They've tried to come up with something that describes their entire universe.
Omnipotent, it's all-encompassing, which is impossible, and ever-changing.
Yeah, and numerous projects, I've got to a point where I've gone, I've got a really good idea, I could do this. And then I realise it's not going to be consistent with the R codes, because no one ever thought that someone might think of this.
Yeah, and then you have to go to 10 design principles, and even if you do that, you have to be excellence in design. And again, I have to remind people, not every building has to be themed excellent in every application. But that's the only option you have if you don't meet this code.
Exactly, but it's actually quite a good object. It's quite a good process, and that's why I keep getting back to this, using the 10 principles as the starting point, because if you come up with something innovative and you're going to have to go down that route anyway, you might as well go down that route to start with, just to enshrine it. And so those 10 principles, I think, are a really good backstop to a new version of the R codes. In fact, I'd add an extra one. This is an 11th one, but I think we'll come to that. So that their third fundamental was focusing on what's important.
Is there one example you can give me about how you would be doing that? Something like plot ratio? Is that saying, look, plot ratio is arbitrary, it's not important, let's just dump it completely? Is that one of the fundamentals you're talking about?
It's one of the details.
Okay, so that, just so we understand what that means. All right, fundamental 4.
So fundamental 4, which we've talked about already, which is that using the 10 principles of SPP7. So as I said before, I think they're really good. I think they're very valuable.
And most people agree on them, which is a path of least resistance to making change, which is good.
Yeah, and people understand, people get them intuitively. They're complex.
The 10 Commandments.
I have often referred to them as the 10 Commandments. As I said before, there's no alignment with the current codes, because the current codes, they're based on something that predated them. So in the later versions, there's a page that lists the 10 principles, but they're not embedded.
They're de facto codes. That's what they are.
They're not embedded. They're not integrated. They sit on the side, and it's the alternative pathway if you stumble on the deem to comply.
All right, and then the final fundamental,
flexibility.
This is probably the most important part of all this. Is the theme of it is that you can't really be flexible if you have a code. They're mutually exclusive things. The more you code, the point is to be less flexible.
Exactly. And in coming up with a highly detailed code, you run the risk of everywhere looking the same. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. We have this homogeny of mediocrity.
I could drop you blindfolded from a helicopter into any suburb on the outer fringe of Perth, and you wouldn't be able to tell where you are, because they all look the same. And I think that's really sad. Whereas if you go to the inner suburbs, there's actually, the architecture of Fremantle's very different different from the architecture of
Mount Lawley.
or Subiaco. We're basically creating anywherevilles. And because the codes are statewide, we're applying that statewide. In theory, a house in Broome is subject to the same codes as one in the suburbs of Perth.
And their needs and standards are so different.
Or Albany, and they're completely different.
Okay, so those are the 5 fundamentals. Firstly, defining what's urban, suburban, and exurban. Secondly, simplifying what our R codes mean in terms of density and built form outcomes. Thirdly, just removing stuff that's frankly unnecessary with regards to getting to the outcomes we're looking for, like plot ratio as an example. Fourthly, let's focus on design principles as a solution. And fifth, let's be flexible. Let's have some agency and some autonomy. If we're a planning officer in a local government or a state government, let's not be scared shitless to actually make some judgment calls and try and be a part of the solution rather than continually restricting and tying the noose tighter. Let's create things and be excited about it.
Yeah, and a lot of planning these days is about ticking the boxes. Whereas if you had a system that was a lot more flexible, I'm sure people would freak out initially at the prospect of not
more fulfilled, I think, Malcolm.
But they would be empowered. They'd get involved. They'd actually make the effort to understand what's driving it and come along on the journey and be a champion. And the other one, which I've highlighted in a post recently, was that the more you codify the planning framework, the more likely it is that someone's going to invent an algorithm in AI to do the job for planners. So if planners actually want to keep a job and the profession wants to remain existing, it may be in their interest to have a broader and more subjective framework.
I honestly think it would be better for society, to be honest. Let's go to what we think some of the practical outcomes might be of that. Now, we're not going to read 8 pages of your summary, but I think some of the highlights of the stuff people care about on a daily basis when developing and living. What do we think might happen when we do that in terms of density, height limits, plot ratio, parking? What are we probably trying to achieve out of this?
Let's start with density, the big D word, which seems to freak an awful lot of people out. And over the years, I've increasingly thought, what is the point of density? What is it you're actually trying to achieve? Why is this place R20 and that place is R30? Or why is this R15 and why is that R17 and a half? What difference does it make?
Who would know the difference?
Who's going to pick it? And then I'm thinking back to, again, I'll talk about Munira and I's, our first home, which was a beautiful old house in the UK. It was actually a 4-story house in a beautiful suburban garden that got converted into about 10 apartments. And we had a studio floor apartment on the ground floor.
You couldn't do that with the R code, even if you didn't change the roof of the house.
But the next door neighbour's house was pretty well much the same. There was an extremely wealthy person with a BMW in the driveway, and him and his wife and a poodle. But from the outside, the 2 houses looked pretty well identical. But in one house, one building, there was 15, 20 people living, and another was 2 and a dog.
Both just as happy as each other.
And
meeting the market.
And it looked the same, and they both looked gorgeous.
Are you saying, can the density-based code system, and in a similar way to what Ross Burnett, who's the chief planner at Town of Mosman Park, is saying as well, and let's just focus on what the built form is and let the amount of people that want to live there and can live there and the market wants to live there go about and do what they want to do. Why are we defining whether a 4x2 house can have 1 family in it or 3 families in it if they all want to live that way?
And it really doesn't matter. I think Ross is absolutely right that it's the form, it's what from the outside, it's the form that matters. Again, whether you've got a single house with a large family with our next door neighbours where there's 6 people living in the house, parents, grown-up children and their partners, or you've got a building that's the same size as that house that's got 4 apartments with 4 single people in.
Or multi-generational families, Malcolm. You go to places like the Dalmatian coast in Croatia and you see a lot of these, what they look like single house, townhouse things that are 2, 3, 4 stories high. The whole family, each family member in their families has an apartment, but from the outside it just looks like quite a large townhouse or a mansion. What's wrong with that? Why can't we do that in Perth? Why aren't we allowed to do that?
So
that will be far better than having your walk-up 6-unit apartment stacks that you see through Balcatta and Nollamara and things.
Yeah, and you also get a great flexibility. So you get local diversity. So at the moment, we code large swathes of an area R20, and then we pick another large swathe and code it R100.
No variety.
And you'll have housing over there, and you'll have apartments over there. And notwithstanding, I like to see a difference between suburban and urban. There's no reason why you can't have suburban and have more affordable housing, smaller housing in there in the mix without necessarily ruining the environment of the place.
What about height limits?
So-
This is one that piss people off all the time, especially developers who are stuck trying to make the finances work with a code that sort of matches the financial parameters of 20 years ago.
I've got a new word for you. It's called batophobia.
What's that?
It's the fear of tall things.
Oh, thanks.
So and it's
There's a lot of people with batophobia in the western
yes,
suburbs.
and it's all over Perth, WA generally. People are obsessed with height. And I think it's because we have a history of single-story housing for 100 years plus. Pretty well everything was single-story. And that's what people are used to. Go to two-story and suddenly you've doubled the height of everything, let alone going to 8 stories. So I think there is an inherent issue there, but we have to go up. There's absolutely
Why aren't we
no
facilitating
doubt about
that
it.
more actively? When you think about John Kerry as the Minister for Housing, Minister for Planning, wanting to pull every lever, surely one of those levers is just letting the market decide what height looks like so that the market has an ability to spread its wings on what can work financially when it comes to height. And I reckon you'll find it's not 50 stories. It's just a couple of stories more than what the R codes allows for most of the time.
Yep, and my experience is that once something's built, give it 6 months, people are used to it. They've seen it. It's no longer an issue. It's a process of getting used to it, but it's something that we have to do. Otherwise, we're just going to keep on sprawling outwards and outwards. It is pretty fundamental. I think increasing height limits is important. I just struggle with the concept of us having a height limit for houses that's essentially 2 stories.
6-7 meters.
Back in the UK, I lived in several houses that were 4 stories tall in a street where other houses were.
I don't think anyone would have a problem with that, especially if there was some uniformity even about that street having that height. Even if there wasn't, to be frank, 2, 3, 4 stories, I don't think anyone really has a big problem with that.
No, it's they shouldn't have. And the beauty is if you allow more height,
Have more setbacks.
you can have more setbacks, you can have more landscape, you can have more trees. It's
If
a
that's what
trade-off.
people are after.
And people
We'll pay for that.
want that. There's a lot of pressure out there to have more landscape and to have the trees.
I think one thing that needs to be fixed, though, along doing that, if we want to go to 4 stories, we need to fix the fire regulation rules that say that once you go over 3 stories, we need to sprinkle the place. We need to have a room for pumps and tanks. This stuff is just adding massive cost to the end buyer, especially if that end buyer is in Belmont.
Yeah, no, I agree. The whole complexity of
God's sake, if you're in an urban
implications and
area, how often
plans.
are you needing fire services in that space? Not that often.
And the other thing I think, probably speaking about height limits, is that when you look at the current codes and you look at the primary controls, the tallest primary control is 9 stories. And yet, here we are, we're seeing towers popping up left and centre. It's an accepted development typology. It's happening. There will be more of them, but the codes is completely silent on towers as a development typology. So it's really quite bizarre. Unless you're RAC0 and then you go and write your own set of principles.
Well, I think that's what they've done. They've just left this extra bucket to say if you're bigger than that, I guess it's just going to be a judgment call at the end of the day. And who needs it, who's going to pay for it, and if you can get it done and we want it, then we'll approve it. If not, it's abhorrent. That's the word we keep using. Are we spoken to plot ratio?
Plot rate.
Everyone agrees. What is the point of this thing?
Yeah, plot ratio. I know this is one of your favourite topics.
Yeah.
Look, in my version of the R codes, I've deleted plot ratio completely.
Explain what plot ratio is.
So plot ratio is essentially the amount of floor space that you can build relative to the area of the site. But it's an old planning control. The more I think about it, the less reason I can see for it being there. I think the only reason it exists is because it's always been there and people have been reluctant to take it out. But it's definitely one of the items that needs to be put in the trash can.
Don't you think that the most beautiful buildings in the world are the ones that aren't restricted by plot ratio?
Yeah, they didn't have plot ratio back in those days. They just did. They basically built as much as they could afford using the technologies that they had at the time.
It's so funny that it's so counterintuitive to what we have to deal with.
Yeah, and you can't see plot ratio. You can't walk down the street and go, "Oh, look, that's a PR 3.6."
Yeah.
It's nonsense. And in fact, I've been through numerous SAT processes where I've produced diagrams and images to show that you can have a taller building that's got a lesser plot ratio than a shorter building. So it's not a control for height.
The problem is, though, this is where we get to in Perth where we can't afford to build apartment buildings. I think you can have a plot ratio or you can have a height limit, but you can't have both, right?
But they're not necessarily a good fit. It's very hard to forget.
Because what happens is you just end up not being able to afford things or trying to get discretions on height. You have to be able to fit certain density in to make things work financially. It's just a reality that most planners don't care about and want it to be your problem to fix. If you get rid of one or both of these things, you just allow the developer to meet the market. The developer's never going to spend $1 on something that's not meeting the market, at least in their judgment. And generally the source of truth will be what the market is demanding. And if you let the developer develop to the market, you're probably going to get, I think, the most appropriate outcome that you don't need to codify.
And you get to that question, get the point where you question what plot ratio is actually controlling. It's not controlling height.
No.
Because you can have a tall building that's got a lower plot ratio than a short building. It's not controlling the bulk of the building, because you can have a building that with a lower plot ratio that looks bulkier, depending on
squat building,
on how it's designed. So it's not doing those.
It's just limiting density again.
It's simply
it limits how many square meters of apartments you can have.
So essentially, it's an equality tax.
Yeah,
it's basically,
that's a great way to put it.
It's a means, and I was wondering whether to use the word Marxist or not, but
no, but it's tax against what apartment development is, which is like socialism. It's giving people opportunities to live in urban environments where they otherwise wouldn't be able to afford it. That's what apartments does, right? And you're taxing the thing that you're trying to encourage.
Exactly. And ultimately what it's doing is basically saying, landowner A, you can't have more floor space than landowner B. And it's basically quality. And both of you, landowner A and B, you can only have so much, because we don't want you to make
too much money or develop too many apartments.
So
even if the market's asking for it, and this one development could fix all these problems rather than requiring 3 to do the same thing.
So I think plot ratio is really dodgy.
What about parking?
Parking? I've never been the parking police on all the DRPs that I sit on.
Some are, especially the Greens. Yeah. The greenie planners and architects have really started to clamp down, and so has the medium density code, which in my opinion is an outcome of a very left-wing agenda. It looks to limit parking.
Yeah, I think parking can be left to market forces.
Why not?
Most of the parking issues have generally arisen because someone hasn't provided enough parking. So it all works. It has largely worked.
Isn't that the irony, Malcolm?
On minimum car parking. You've got to have at least this number of car bays, and which obviously adds.
I think at the end of the day, you market lead it, right? Yeah. We've seen great examples like the Nightingale developments going up in Melbourne where they had nearly no parking. People want to pay for them, want to live there. Great.
Yeah, and I think if a developer is brave enough to take to market a development that has no car parking,
go for it.
Good on them.
So no maximum, no minimum. Just meet the market. People can trade between. You might have times where there's a bit more parking than you need for some people. They can sell their parking to the other person. As they change in their lives, they have kids now, their kids get their own cars. All these things can change. Let's have flexibility about that, but at least provision for it. If the market in that area loves their cars or would have multi-generational living, and in this really ultra-urban area, couldn't get a car down the street anyway, we don't need cars then.
And I don't subscribe to that notion of a maximum car parking either, because I think the market looks after itself.
A developer's not going to put 50 car bays in when the market's only asking for 30.
Particularly in a suburban area. I think the issue is more one of design. Is if you're going to put lots of car bays in, put them in a place where they're not going to be seen. So if they're in the basement, who cares?
Who does it hurt if you have a second floor of basement rather than just one floor of basement?
Exactly.
Nobody.
You can see it. And there comes a point where in an urban environment where it becomes so congested, and I worked with a traffic engineer in the Middle East who said congestion is actually the greatest tool known to traffic engineers. Whereas we think it's a problem, but it's actually a tool. You tighten up the traffic flow, people stop driving and they catch public transport instead. I'm flexible. I worked a project last year where it was a house where the owner was a car nut. He absolutely loved cars. It was his a hobby and obsession. He had a collection of 12 cars. Can't drive them all at the same time. If he's got 12 cars in his basement, who cares?
Yeah.
So I'm easy on that.
Setbacks,
I think they could be very much simplified. It's gone overboard, and it's all to do with privacy. The R codes goes overboard on that. I think you just draw a line in the sand as to what's reasonable and what's not, and you live with it. I think you can generally decrease setbacks for urban typologies, where buildings really ought to come to the street, ought to touch each other. And I think the opposite, and this might be controversial, I think setbacks should be increased for suburban typologies so that we get more landscape around the house.
As you said before, make suburban be suburban.
Yes.
Or let it be suburban. And then I think we can finally think to some more communal facilities. It's interesting, isn't it, how we look at apartments and we look at townhouses, and sometimes you see arbitrary community facilities that no one uses. And I think some developers are doing it really well these days, where they're putting in minimal facilities based on the area, but also in areas where they've created their own hub, like Civic Heart in South Perth, where they've put a bunch of facilities in there because they believe the market will ask for it.
And I think it's the same to the markets. I think if you're doing high-end apartments, then in a large development, then yes, there's a great opportunity to have the swimming pool and the saunas and the gyms and all the other luxuries. If you're doing affordable housing in Mandurah, which I'm doing at the moment.
Why do we need a pool? Why do we need to pay for a pool? Why do we need gardens that we have to communally pay for? If we want to put a garden, we'll put it in our own balcony.
I had a project in Queen's Park a few years back, which we took to the DRP, and the DRP suggested that it's affordable rental housing. The DRP suggested that every one of the top floor units should have its own private rooftop terrace.
Yeah.
In Queen's Park.
Yeah. This is the sort of stuff that kills development. And it's funky ideas coming out of left wing from arbitrary design reviews and things like that, Malcolm, that do put developers off and add risk and time and therefore money. That's the tough one.
Yeah, look, I think I'm a huge advocate for design reviews. My wife and I, we sit on around 20 DRPs together. I've been doing design review for 15 years or longer. And in my experience, it works, and it works really well. Maybe I'm blessed that the DRPs that I sit on, particularly the ones I chair, are actually really good.
I think what I would do is I would agree with you, but caveat that with one thing you've added to your summary, which is that it's all well and good. It's all helpful to the extent that it's realistic.
Yes, and that's why in my version, I have added in an 11th design principle. Admittedly, it doesn't have quite the ring as 10, because association with the 10 commandments. But for me, the one that's always been missing is that one of realism. It's about being practical, about being real, not going off on a flight of fancy either.
Not gold plating.
Not gold plating. And if you're reviewing an affordable rental housing project in the back of Armidale, recognize what it's trying to achieve and where it's trying to achieve and treat it accordingly.
And get on with it.
Yeah, but if you're doing a luxury apartment in Cottesloe,
let's have a chat and let's add value.
Exactly. So it's horses for courses. It's about being realistic and particularly for DRP, because I think for me, if you go down the road with a much simpler set of codes, then DRPs have a bigger role to play. And I think that's fine as long as they work well. And for me, that working well means that they have to be realistic.
It can't be a pissing contest. It can't be about who's got the best ideas. Sometimes the best ideas is no ideas. Just look at it, affirm that, hey, this is pretty appropriate. Nip and tuck here, just for some friendly advice that we think will help you meet the market. I think that should always be the goal. Design review to help you meet the market, not to meet some subjective idea of what's cool this year.
The ultimate aim is, can this be delivered? Can it be built? Can it be delivered?
Can it be bought?
Yeah.
Or will it be bought? Because there's no point in building something that no one wants to live in or will enjoy living in.
Otherwise, everything we do as urban designers or planners becomes academic.
Which is what 485 pages ends up being, Malcolm.
Yes.
Mate, what a fantastic episode. I really hope a lot of the players in this industry, in the design and planning space, are listening to this all the way through, because it's been valuable, I think, all the way through, and start having some proper conversations with the people at the DPLH, with Mr. Kerry, about, and I know you've had preliminary discussions with people about what we might be able to do to just break the wheel here and try and get back on the right track without continuing with the pimped up Kingswood, as you said.
Yeah, look, I have a reputation for being a bit of a troublemaker and stirring the pot, and I'm quite proud of that role. It's one that I take on happily. But I think this is a really good opportunity to simplify things, make better. And in that respect, I'm throwing down the gauntlet.
And I am facilitating it. So thank you very much, Malcolm. Let's hope we can see some progress out of this, and I hope to have a chat again about how this is moving.
Thank you, Trent.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!